It's Lee from Colouring Queen, and it's colour and story time again. I'm colouring again from Mandalen by Trolle, and this time I'm going to colour a little dragon for my Things That Fly in July colour along. I'm using my Prismacolor, and I've put a sticky note on the page with the pencils as requested by a few people. But please know I don't do tutorials, and I'm certainly just a beginner colorist and not up to giving tutorials. It's just colour and stories with me. So saying that, I'll put the names of the pencils here on the sticky note, and I'll try to remember to put them in the description, but it's not a tutorial. So since we last chatted, I've flown to Sydney for 3 days, and we arrived last Saturday morning, managed to have a cup of coffee with David's mum, and then we rolled up our sleeves and started really getting into it. Last time we were there, it was raining all the time, and we decided to repave the backyard, and we just didn't get it finished because of the rain. So this time the weather was fine, so paving began in earnest. And of course the pavers I chose were over 20 kilos each, so David had the job of putting those down, and I did the small brick pavers and the stepping stones. But we mulched all the garden, we put in some stepping stones, we did more cleaning, did a bit more painting, and in the meantime we also had to drive out and move a pinball machine from the house to a storage facility, and that was the bit that I was most worried about because it's really heavy, and David always expects me to help, and I was panicking that I would not be able to lift my share of it, but luckily a friend with some muscles helped load it into the van, and then we took it to our storage container. But first, of course, we had to get in, and we hadn't been in for a while, so long in fact that we'd forgotten what key opens it. So I'd actually flown down with 3 pencil cases full of every key that we owned, trying to work out which one it was. And so we're trying to unlock these padlocks, and we're there for like half an hour. It was a case of like Prince Charming and the slipper from Cinderella. Nothing would fit. And I was just about to go to the hardware store and see if we could get bolt cutters or an angle grinder to cut the lock off, when, wouldn't you know it, the smallest keys were the winner. The ones that David thought couldn't possibly fit the lock, they were the ones that did. So now they've been properly labelled and put away. And so we ended up, I thought it was going to be a nightmare moving this pinball because we'd have to lift it and whatnot, but we got a van where the back doors opened up, so I jumped in and pushed, and were able to wiggle it from the back into position with David at the back, catching it while I was pushing it. And yeah, no heavy lifting involved, and you cannot imagine how relieved I was. But poor David, he had to basically climb over the whole thing to get out of the container. So we ended up going back to the house and stopping in at David's mum's for a coffee before we left, and we ended up finishing the house and all the cleaning, mopping the floor with 2 minutes to spare to get to the airport. So, and that included a trip back to the garden shop to get another couple of bags of mulch because we were running short. And then it was back home, flying back to Brisbane and getting back to Buddy and Millie. First of all, we couldn't remember where we'd parked the car, but luckily it was where we thought it was, so that was good. And so we got back home, but to be honest, all week we've been really confused with what city we're in. Are we in Sydney? Are we in Brisbane? It's really confusing when you keep going between these two cities. So hopefully we won't have to go back to Sydney for a while, and we can remember what it's like to be in Brisbane, because it's just too confusing otherwise. You forget which shops you're going to and what roads you're on and all the rest of it. And speaking of being confused, poor little Buddy, he's had 5 seizures on Friday. If you follow him on Instagram, you'll see him coming out of his emergency vets, and he's got his little green pressure bandage on because he had to have a little IV drip. And 5 seizures within the 24 hours, so a set of clusters, and he had so many vets looking after him. He's still not himself. He had to stay overnight, and he really goes through it. He's got some more medicines now that they've given him for his epilepsy, so they're adding in another medication into the mix, and hopefully it's going to take effect, but it does take a couple of months to take effect, and in the meantime we have to keep track on it with some blood tests and whatnot. And then after it takes effect, we're going to try and remove one of his medicines as a day-to-day medicine and use it for when he has these cluster seizures. But it really just sucks what he goes through, and he's so disorientated still, and he's not answering commands. We wanted to take him to the park this morning, but he was uncertain. He wouldn't get into the car, and then we took him for a walk just locally, and he was just puttering along. He really, couldn't walk very far, and we just thought better let him just rest because, we thought he'd be a little bit more ahead and that he'd want to go for a walk, but poor little thing, he's just still exhausted and still sort of disorientated and confused. But anyway, hopefully by tomorrow he will be a lot better. But anyway, enough chitty chat about my life. Let's get down to today's story. So today's story, I thought we'd stick with the fraud theme that was featured in my latest coffee crime colouring video. So here we go. Mr. and Mrs. Hall were a married couple living in their home near Bathurst in New South Wales, Australia. Mr. Hall operated a business, but it wasn't doing too well. In fact, he was in a lot of debt. And he hadn't discussed these debts with his wife. He was just keeping it to himself on the down low. And she was completely oblivious about the financial situation, thinking that everything was just going along well. But Mr. Hall, he was under pressure to pay these debts, and so he devised what he thought was a cunning plan. He could raise the money and repay the debts by just refinancing the mortgage on the home. And in effect, he'd increase the amount of debt that was secured on the family home. And he decided to do this without his wife's knowledge, even though they both owned the family home, and she wouldn't be aware that they were now in more debt on their family home. So he applied for a loan, and he instructed a solicitor to act for him and for his wife because they both owned the home, so they both had to take out the mortgage. In relation to this mortgage finance. Now, a solicitor was required because certain documents needed to be signed by a solicitor or a justice of the peace. So Mr. Hall informed the solicitor that he'd appointed that his wife was dying of cancer and she couldn't attend the solicitor's office or actually be contacted even by phone. And this wasn't true. Mrs. Hall didn't have cancer. He also told the solicitor that his wife was holding a bit of a grudge with the solicitor. As often happens in small towns, the solicitor had previously acted for someone against the Halls. It was actually a creditor, someone that was owed money by the Halls, and he acted for them in a debt recovery proceedings. And so Mr. Hall told the solicitor that his wife was holding a bit of a grudge about that matter. And The solicitor accepted these reasons why Mrs. Hall didn't want anything to do with him, didn't want to have any contact with him at all. And Mr. Hall said that he would go and get his wife to sign the mortgage document, and he, Mr. Hall, would return it to the solicitor having been signed and witnessed by a JP, which is required. A JP stands for Justice of the Peace. I think in the US you might call this a notary, I'm not sure. So Mr. Hall then signed the documents in front of the solicitor, and the documents were then given to him so that he could obtain his wife's signature. The documents were then returned, showing that Mrs. Hall had signed the mortgage, and a document called Declaration of Independent Legal Advice, which is basically given by a solicitor stating that they've provided advice about the mortgage because it's an important document, there's a lot of financial implications, was also signed. And these documents were witnessed not by a solicitor but by a Justice of the Peace called Mr. Graham. Now in Australia, Justice of the Peace can be anyone, you don't need any legal qualifications. You just apply for it, you need to be of good character, fill in a form, and then you can get appointed and you'll have rights to sign or witness certain documents. So you don't have to have any legal knowledge at all, but you do need to be familiar with the statutory or the legislation in the particular state for Justice of the Peace, i.e. what they're allowed to do and what the rules are. So anyway, the transaction went through. Mr. Hall ended up with all that extra money that he wanted. He could repay his debts. All the money was made out to him. The new mortgage was registered, and that was on the title of the family home. So things went swimmingly and everyone was happy. But it was about 2 years later that things took a bit of a turn, because 2 years later, Mr. Hall died. And it was then that Mrs. Hall discovered something. She was going through the process for probate, which is what happens to someone's assets, etc., once someone dies. So because they both owned the home, during probate, this would be put into Mrs. Hall's name solely, as she had survived Mr. Hall. And it was then that she noticed that the family home had a mortgage on it. And she obtained a copy of the mortgage and found out that it was for a significant amount of money. Not only that, her signature was on it, but she'd never actually signed this document. So as the mortgage was already registered, Mrs. Hall didn't have that many options, and the best one was to sue the solicitor and the Justice of the Peace for negligence. So what was the negligence exactly? Well, in relation to the Justice of the Peace, it turns out that Mr. Graham, the JP, he didn't actually see Mrs. Hall sign the document as he should have, because they're meant to be signed in the presence of a solicitor or a JP. He had just signed his name below where Mrs. Hall had signed. And of course, Mrs. Hall had never signed at all. He'd never witnessed someone signing that document. Her husband had forged her signature without her knowledge. Mr. Graham had actually never even knew Mrs. Hall, and he'd never met her in person or otherwise. And so he should have known that not being in her presence for this important document that will mortgage her home and give a financial benefit, he should have protected her interests, even though he'd never met her and she wasn't there in front of him in his presence. And the court said that this risk was reasonably foreseeable. They also said that she was in a vulnerable position as she was ignorant of what was taking place. if someone had just queried where was she and before they'd witnessed her signature, maybe this whole fraud or forgery could have been discovered, because the mortgage is a super important document. It may give you extra money, like it did in this case with the refinancing of the property, but it also makes you liable to repay the debt. And that's what the court said. And Mrs. Hall or Mr. Hall might have defaulted on that debt, and Mrs. Hall could have lost the family home and also been liable to pay for this debt that she knew nothing about. And so the court said that the Justice of the Peace was morally blameworthy or dishonest. In relation to the solicitor, he'd breached a duty of care to his client, Mrs. Hall. And she still was his client because he was acting for both of them, even though he never seen her in person. What he should have done was contact her, or if it was genuine that she didn't want to speak to him and held this grudge, he should have arranged for someone else in his office to phone her or visit her if she was too unwell to come to the office. Of course, if he'd done that, it would have been really easy to discover that she wasn't sick, she didn't have cancer, and he could have got her instructions in person. He could have personally advised her about the transaction and the financial consequences of entering into it. And the court said he should have queried why a woman who apparently had cancer would agree to such a significant increase on the mortgage of the family home, which she would have a liability to repay as well as a husband. And the court also said that he failed to take reasonable steps to protect her interest. He shouldn't have just accepted her husband's explanation and reasons. And when he was actually cross-examined in court on this, he admitted that he heard alarm bells about the transaction and something wasn't quite right to him, but he didn't pay enough attention to those alarm bells going off. And the court found that both the solicitor and the Justice of the Peace were negligent, with the solicitor being responsible for 60% of the damages payout and the Justice of the Peace 40%. Now, they were not happy, obviously, and they both appealed. It was particularly hard for the JP because, as I said, there's no legal qualifications for Justice of the Peace in Australia, but saying that, they also can't charge for their service. It's a free service, you're not entitled to charge, and also they don't have insurance, whereas solicitors charge for their work, and they also have professional indemnity insurance in case, of things like this. So they both appealed, the solicitor and the Justice of the Peace, but the Court of Appeal said no. And they basically identified a new form of duty of care where you have to avoid economic loss, so a financial loss. And for the instance of the JP, because he had a duty, according to the court, to try and avoid this financial loss. Even though, as I said, they're not legally qualified, they don't have insurance, but the court found that it was a duty owed by anyone witnessing a document, regardless whether they're a Justice of the Peace or a solicitor, where they have to protect people from the possibility of fraud. So it's a super interesting case from a legal point of view. And, I think it's one that a lot of justices of the peace in Australia should be aware of, that there is this liability and, they could end up in court, and it's not unusual to end up in court to give information about what document you've signed, but to actually be found liable. But on the other hand, he did witness a document that had a signature already on it, and he didn't see them sign it. All of those clauses always say in the presence of, so meaning they sign in front of you. So you don't take something pre-signed and expect somebody to witness it. But yeah, it's hard. It's a tough decision for the Justice of the Peace. I think the solicitor should have known with those mortgage documents that you wouldn't advise one person and not the other. That, I think the court got it right on that one. But for the Justice of the Peace, I feel a little sorry for them because they don't have insurance and whatnot, but they still should never have witnessed a document that was already pre-signed. But I'd love to know, as always, what you think, and I'd love to know, like, if it's similar in other countries. This is just the way it was in New South Wales, in Australia. It's a hard job, like Justice of the Peace. I'm one in Queensland, and often you get asked to witness things. People ring me all the time asking me to witness stuff and whatnot. During COVID, I wasn't doing it, but you always have to be very cautious about what it is that you're witnessing, and make sure you keep a record of it, and just make sure that you check everyone's identity and whatnot. There's so many rules and whatnot to be on board with nowadays, but this case took place about 10 years ago, so it's not that long ago, but still long enough. I'm sure a lot of Justice of the Peaces were sort of quivering afterwards, going, oh my God, what, I hope I've never done this type of thing, because, there's so many ways that people commit fraud, and forging signatures is always, of course, the number one way. But, if you had a solicitor that was double checking and a JP that was also checking, this would never have taken place. Mrs. Hall still would have had her house. People would have queried it. They would have phoned her. They would have required her to sign in front of her. They wouldn't take the husband's instructions as acting for both, because they're two individuals. So, if everyone had just done what they were meant to do, it would never have happened. But interesting case. I'd love to hear what you think. And there's so many of these types of cases. I chose this one because I haven't talked about solicitors getting into trouble before, and I thought I'd better, because it's not always a one-way street of individuals getting in trouble. Solicitors get in trouble all the time for all different sorts of things, but I thought this one was pretty interesting because it had the solicitor, the JP, and the innocent wife there in the background not knowing anything. But I'd love to know what you think, and I think that's probably it from me. Very short video today, working on a few other things. I've got to try and finish up this picture, and I'm not sure if I'm going to add a little bit of aqua or something to the dragon. I want to try and get some leaves done and come back for a second video and show you what I've done with the leaves and whatnot, because otherwise I can see that this picture is going to take me too long if I colour it all on camera. And what else? I've got a few other things. On my crime channel, I've got 2 new cases coming up this week. Both of them, of course, are awful, but that's the nature of crime channels, so I hope you check it out. The channel is below. So I think that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.